Hello ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Clout UI. To celebrate 200 subscribers, I asked you guys for videos that I should do. And the first I'm going to be doing is what if Ethiopia formed an empire. This was suggested to me by Dr. Business. So yeah, let's get right into it. Now, Ethiopia has been extremely large at times. Currently, I'm pretty sure this is one of the smaller moments of its life. For example, it used to own Eritrea. I don't know how to pronounce that, and then also Djibouti. So yeah, it used to rule these two countries up here. But if they are going to form an empire, they will probably reinvade these countries. They begin with a push into Djibouti that goes extremely well, knocking out the nation. They begin to snake into Eritrea. That's how I'm just going to pronounce it because it won't matter later in the video when it's dead. Ethiopia snakes up the coastline, is taking all of it, and eventually collapses the nation. In a peace treaty, the two nations are completely annexed by Ethiopia. Neighboring countries such as the Sudans and Somalia begin to feel threatened by the nation. However, there is one country that very much does not approve of what Ethiopia has just done. That is Egypt. Egypt and Ethiopia hold extremely sour relations. So in retaliation, Ethiopia will create an alliance between them, Sudan, and believe it or not, South Sudan. It's a miracle that the two nations are on the same side, but they kind of are, considering the fact that Ethiopia is kind of a menace to society right now. Meanwhile, in Somalia, something interesting happens. Somaliland, which already is pushing for its independence, and I'm pretty sure recognizes itself, randomly takes some of their army and casually invades into Somalia. Now, Somalia and Somaliland have, I'm pretty sure, been at war for a little bit now. But Somaliland does surprisingly good. In fact, it's kind of suspicious. And eventually the suspicions of Somalia are confirmed when Ethiopian troops are spotted in Somaliland. Shortly afterwards, Ethiopia will declare war on Somalia and begin an invasion into the country. They meet up with Somaliland forces, which begin to take the rest of the coastline that Somalia has. Ethiopia begins to take the border next to Kenya, frightening Kenya as they begin to ask Egypt if they can join their alliance. However, Egypt will not allow Kenya to join the alliance, as they're going to talk with Sudan and South Sudan and see if they approve of it. Elsewhere, Ethiopia and Somaliland take all of Somalia's coastline, and eventually the country capitulates. In a peace treaty, Somaliland gains independence while the rest of Somalia is taken under Ethiopian rulership. Now, realistically, this empire would be extremely unstable, but we're just going to throw that away and say that it's completely stable. Somaliland will ally with Ethiopia, meaning Ethiopia now has their first ally. Ethiopia will send an ultimatum to Kenya demanding this section of land. Kenya gives this land over so as to avoid any war. Shortly afterwards, however, they'll join the alliance with Egypt as South Sudan, Sudan, and Egypt decide that it's okay. Just like that, Ethiopia is looking a lot bigger. From here, they'll demand this island from, I'm pretty sure Saudi Arabia owns it. However, Saudi Arabia does not give it, so Ethiopia declares war on them. By the way, in case I haven't mentioned this yet, because I don't think I have, major alliances such as NATO, EU, UN, alliances like that have been completely destroyed. However, relations haven't, and so Oman will be pressured by Saudi Arabia to join the war on their side. However, this will drag in Yemen. Unfortunately, Yemen will become a third-party country, as Somaliland will declare war on them. This island that Yemen owns is quickly taken as the Ethiopian Empire land in Saudi Arabia. Unfortunately, this area is extremely mountainous, and so they will struggle to push into it any further. They will convince northern Yemen to support them, and northern Yemen will declare independence. On the other side of Yemen, they are being pushed in by Oman and Saudi Arabia until the country capitulates. Ethiopia then begins to invade into invaded parts of Yemen. Meanwhile, Ethiopian troops will begin to push up Saudi Arabian coastline. They push up further and further until eventually they take Mecca, which I'm pretty sure is somewhere in this area, dealing a really big blow to Saudi Arabia. The Ethiopian Empire demands that Saudi Arabia will get to Mecca back only if they surrender. So, Saudi Arabia surrenders. Oman, however, doesn't, and quickly begins to be invaded. They stand no chance to the Ethiopian and Somaliland forces, and eventually are shrunk to these enclaves. One enclave is navally invaded, but the other is being blocked by the UAE, which doesn't allow them to go through. Ethiopian Empire threatens invasion, and then the UAE allows them to go through, and the rest of Oman is invaded. In a peace treaty, northern Yemen gets independence. Yemen loses this island right here, and the Ethiopian Empire annexes small bits from Saudi Arabia. North Yemen is similar to Somaliland, will get more land than it wants, which it'll greatly support, despite the fact that this may lead to war or civil wars or stuff like that. North Yemen will ally to the Ethiopian Empire. So now this is what we're looking at. Uganda, Rwanda, and Burundi will join the Purple Alliance. While this sea right here becomes much more difficult to travel through. Originally, you have to pay to go through Egypt. However, now this area over here is next to both the Ethiopian Empire and North Yemen, which is more of a Western Yemen, but we're still going to call it North Yemen. So if boats want to go through the Suez Canal or out of the Suez Canal, they also have to pay the Ethiopian Empire and North Yemen if they want to go through. Tensions in this area are at an all-time high, but something terrible happens when Egypt does something extremely stupid. As some boats travel through this area that Ethiopia and North Yemen are making people pay to go through, Egyptian boats are going with them, and they fire at Ethiopian and Northern Yemen boats that come to collect money for payment to go through the area. In retaliation, the Ethiopian Empire declares war on Egypt. Egypt, however, will get Sudan involved alongside South Sudan and Kenya, who gets Uganda, Rwanda, and Burundi involved as well. The Ethiopian Empire gets both northern Yemen and Somaliland involved as well. A push into Kenya is quickly made, and Kenya quickly loses all of their coastline. However, due to mountains in this area, only northern parts of Kenya are able to be taken over. However, Ethiopian forces move along this lake, eventually taking all of it. Yemen gets involved, as does Saudi Arabia, as the two countries hope to regain some of their lost land. The countries will begin to take some of their lost land, such as this island from Yemen and northern Yemen, until eventually northern Yemen looks more similar to the real northern Yemen. Meanwhile, parts of modern-day Eritrea begin to be invaded by Sudan and Egyptian forces, while Ethiopian forces continue to push now into South Sudan. Eventually, they create a arrowhead aimed towards Uganda. It eventually cuts off Kenya, mostly border-wise. However, they still can travel to Sudan and South Sudan and countries like that through this small opening, but unfortunately it is quickly taken, leaving Kenya and parts of Uganda surrounded. More of these areas begin to fall until eventually the surrounded part of Uganda surrenders and Kenya begins to be invaded by Ethiopian troops, and eventually they surrender as well. More of Uganda is invaded, and eventually southern Uganda, Burundi, and Rwanda are cut off from the rest of Uganda, the Sudans, and Egypt. Rwanda surrenders, Burundi surrenders, and then the surrounded Ugandan forces surrender, followed by the rest of Uganda. Saudi Arabian troops cross into the Ethiopian Empire, retaking their lost land, and then push into northern Yemen. Meanwhile, Somalia declares independence and rebels from the Ethiopian Empire. They quickly begin a push into Somaliland, retaking the coastline that they once had, except not all of it, as Ethiopia still holds some parts in the south. Meanwhile, Sudanese troops are pushed out of modern-day Eritrea, and as they retreat, Ethiopian forces chase them, beginning an invasion into Sudan. Eventually, a push towards major cities in South Sudan is created. Eventually, two fronts combine, and parts of South Sudan are cut off, encircled, and then destroyed. More of Somaliland begins to fall, until eventually the entire country surrenders. And a push to retake more of Somalia's old land is created. Meanwhile, northern Yemen falls. However, while some things aren't looking the best for the Ethiopian Empire, other things are, as now all of the land next to their border has been invaded, meaning that the only way to invade them is naval invasions. They begin to liberate northern Yemen. Eventually, all of the country is liberated, and they push into the invaded Ethiopian Empire's lands is created and goes well. Ethiopian regains land from the Somalia rebellion in the south, which goes extremely well, until eventually all of Somalia is pushed back to Somaliland borders. Eventually, a push into Somaliland is created, and eventually their government is reestablished as the Somalia rebellion is cut into two. Yemen begins to be invaded. After a really short fight, After Yemen surrenders, a new push into Saudi Arabia is conducted, which goes extremely well. They begin to snake up the coastline of Saudi Arabia. However, Saudi Arabian troops eventually arrive and the border stalemate. The same cannot be said with the African front, however, as the southern parts of South Sudan are completely invaded, until eventually South Sudan just is their northern section. Turns out Sudan wasn't supporting them very well. I wonder why. I guess we won't know though, because eventually all of South Sudan is completely invaded, along with parts that both South Sudan and Sudan claims. The Somalian rebellion finally ends, and Somaliland regains most of their mainland, and eventually begins to invade parts of the island, which goes extremely well as the rest of Yemen was stationed there. But now that Yemen is now gone, it's only up to Sudan, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia to defeat the three allies: Ethiopian Empire, Somaliland, and northern Somalia. Northern Yemen. Saudi Arabia's coastline is once again put under siege, and Mecca is once again taken. Eventually, all of Saudi Arabia's coast is taken in the east, and a push into the Sinai Peninsula begins. Eventually, all of the peninsula falls, and Saudi Arabia surrenders, hoping that it'll allow Ethiopia to not be as harsh when they inevitably do a peace treaty. Considering the fact that Ethiopian Empire holds Mecca, they feel that once again all hope is lost. A push to where I'm pretty sure Sudan's capital is at is created and goes well as Sudan loses their capital. Ethiopian Empire begins a push up the coastline, eventually taking all disputed land with both Sudan and Egypt. Egypt, however, will hold an extremely good front, stalemating both fronts that are going towards them, meaning that Ethiopian troops are mostly going to be focused on taking Sudan out of the war. They begin a push further into Sudan, which goes very well, until eventually all of southern Sudan and not South Sudan is completely taken and Sudan just surrenders. Egypt miraculously is able to continue this stalemate, except for a little bit in the south, where small amounts of Ethiopian troops push into Egypt. Unprotected parts of Egypt begin to be invaded, until eventually most of the Egyptian desert is circled and the few troops, if any there, surrender. The stalemate occurs for about 2 years, but eventually that stalemate is broken when Ethiopia begins to push along the Nile River. They begin to snake up the river, and as Egyptian troops are diverted, the western part of Egypt's coast is taken, and eventually more of Egypt begins to fall to Ethiopia. Eventually, Egypt's capital is taken, and all of the Nile River is invaded. The two fronts in Egypt unite, Western Egypt is surrendering. Egyptian forces, however, are told to not surrender in eastern Egypt. Eventually, they lose all their coastline and capitulate. Ethiopia, Somaliland, and northern Yemen miraculously win this war. So let's take a look really quickly at a peace treaty before this video is over. In a peace treaty, northern Yemen annexes the rest of Yemen. The Ethiopian Empire expands as well. Of course, they expand them further into Saudi Arabia, or up their coastline. However, they will also annex parts of the Sinai Peninsula, where I believe the Suez Canal is at. This is to limit Egypt's power, preventing them from using the Suez Canal from gaining resources. Or money, at least. However, Ethiopia now owns the canal. I think they do, at least. I'm pretty sure that's where the canal is located at. And so the Ethiopian Empire will be the one using this canal now. Parts of Sudan, South Sudan, and Kenya are annexed. Kenya gains this really bad panhandle, which they in the future may give to Uganda. However, I don't know if they'll give it to Uganda, because that's unfortunately where we will be leaving off this video. If you enjoyed the video, then make sure to like it. Leave a comment tell me your reaction. Do you think it's realistic? Unrealistic? We threw realism away a little bit. Ethiopia was really buffed. You know what I should have done? I should have added a puppet states. Yeah, I really should have done that. This is a long video, and I would think that's a good thing because, of course, 200 subscriber special. This is the first of many. So, yeah, join the Discord, linked in the description. I will see you guys next time. Peace. See ya.